So this is the camera I chose. This is the Fuji X100V, and in this video I'm going to talk about why I chose this guy over the other Fuji cameras in the Fuji lineup. So a couple weeks back I actually hired one of these guys. I hired a Fuji X100V, and during my 2-day hire I realised that I absolutely love Fuji. So let's say you're in the market for a crop sensor Fuji. What are your options? First up, you have the Fuji X-Pro series of cameras that are currently in their 3rd iteration. It's a rangefinder styled bodied camera with Fuji's clever optical and EVF viewfinder system. It's weather resistant and also has a bit of a funny screen on the back, which shows you your film emulation mode, and you have to fold the screen down to be able to see your usual screen that you'd expect. You then have the Fuji X100V. It's an awful lot like the Fuji X-Pro series. It's smaller and has a fixed lens. The fixed lens on the front of the camera is a 23mm f2 lens, which is a 35mm equivalent. It's also weather sealed as long as you use a lens filter kit on the front of it, and comes with pretty much all of the pro features that you get in the X-Pro3. Next up, you then have the newly released X-E4. Again, this is slightly smaller and it loses the optical viewfinder system, but adds back the interchangeable lenses, but does also lose the weather resistance. Beyond this style of camera, you also have the X-T4, which is Fuji's typical sort of mirrorless camera. It's got that form factor that everybody's come to know. I did, however, discount this camera immediately. I know it's an amazing camera, but it overlaps for me too much with my Sony a7 III. I did previously have an X-T2 and it was the A7 that replaced that, although arguably it is the best camera in their lineup, and if it's your only camera, it's probably the best choice for you. So this left me with 3 cameras. This left me with the Fuji X100V that we know I chose, and also the X-Pro3 and the X-E4. And in this video, we're going to take a bit of a dive into each of those, and I'll explain why I didn't choose them. So let's start with the Fuji X-Pro3. This was the camera I was so certain I was going to buy, to the point that before I'd done too much research, I was already looking through eBay at the classifieds, and it actually offered some people some money for one. It's a camera that packs all of the pro specs I could want. It's got the dual viewfinder system, it's got that lovely rangefinder style body, it's got that pretty divisive screen on the back that I would actually love. It fits quite nicely into my film photography background, and you can always flip the screen down and use it as a normal screen anyway. It's also an interchangeable lens camera, so I could have adapted some of my Leica glass, as well as having lots of variety in terms of lens choice from Fuji. However, the more research I did into the camera, the more I realised that it wasn't really the camera for me. So the Fuji X-Pro3 body only is actually the most expensive camera in this lineup. It's more expensive than the X100V, even though this has a fixed lens. If you take the Fuji 23mm f2 lens, which is one of their cheaper lenses, and combine that with the X-Pro3 body, price-wise, you're looking at about £2,200, about $2,300, whereas the X100V is more like £1,300 or $1,400. That's a price difference of about £1,000 or dollars, and it's heading towards twice as much. I also couldn't help but think that the X-Pro3 is probably one of the next cameras in line to get an update, and at the point a camera gets upgraded, the current ones lose an awful lot of value, and that wasn't something I wanted to contend with. Like I said though, that is 100% speculation. I could be completely wrong, but it was something that played on my mind. Also, once you add a lens to the X-Pro3, it does become quite a big package. Quite a lot of the Fuji lenses are quite big, especially when you compare them to, say, like Leica lenses. And that's a lot to do with the fact that the Fuji lenses obviously have autofocus, and that limits them and makes them quite big in size. And by the time you've put a lens on the front of the X-Pro3, the actual dimensions of the camera do get quite big compared to the pancake lens on the X100V. From a weight point of view, the X-Pro3 and the 23mm come in at 667 grams, whereas the X100V comes in at 478 grams. So again, there's quite a reasonable difference in terms of weight and also dimensions. Now onto the big one for me, and I know this is pretty subjective because this was a requirement that I had, and that's the optical viewfinder. I fell in love with the optical viewfinder whilst I was hiring that X100V a few weeks back. I didn't, however, know that the X-Pro3 actually dropped a feature that the X-Pro1 and 2 had. So the X-Pro1 and 2, you were able to change the magnification of the viewfinder that let you use a bigger variety of lenses. The X-Pro3 dropped that feature and just went for a magnification slap bang in the middle. This means that the widest lens you can use and use the optical viewfinder is about 23mm, so 35mm equivalent. Now to me, this quickly quickly reduced the set of lenses that I'd want to use with this camera. I know if you wanted to go wider or much longer, you could use the EVF, but it was the optical viewfinder that I fell in love with whilst I had the camera for 2 days. From that perspective, the X-Pro3 kind of loses one of its positives in terms of it being interchangeable lenses. So the X100V, you can actually get 2 different adapters, one that turns it into a 28mm and one that turns it into a 50mm, that pretty much then covers everything the optical viewfinder can see for far cheaper than the lenses would cost if you bought separate Fuji lenses for the X-Pro3. It was about this point that I decided that the X-Pro3 no longer made sense for me. For a camera that costs almost twice as much, we was looking at a camera that is bigger, it's heavier, it costs more, and has the same sort of flexibility as a fixed lens camera because of my personal use case. This doesn't mean though that we are not going to see an X-Pro3 on the channel. I do plan on hiring one at some point as I have a few cool video ideas and I'd love to try one out. So onto the new kid on the block, the Fuji X-E4. This is a pretty new camera and it comes in at a very nice price point. Price-wise, we're looking at £799, $849, and it is an interchangeable lens camera, so you also have to factor in a lens too, which brings up the cost slightly, but it usually costs still slightly less than the X100V. However, you can probably guess my main issue if you know anything about the X-E4, and that's the fact that it doesn't have the optical viewfinder, and it meant I was missing out on one of the features that I really loved about Fuji. It is also missing weather sealing, and that's quite a big deal to me. This is currently my only weather sealed camera. The Sony a7 III arguably is, but I don't have any weather sealed lenses, and the camera's also known for not being very well weather sealed. This makes the X100V the only camera I can currently shoot in the rain, and that's quite handy when it's alongside the M240 and the M6 I also frequently shoot. The X-E4 might also be the smallest camera of the bunch, but by the time you fitted something like a 23mm f2, the camera really isn't that much different to the X100V. It might be slightly smaller from a body point of view, but the X100V with this pancake lens ends up having, I think, more desirable dimensions, even if the weight is pretty much the same. As with anything like this though, this is all very subjective, and if it wasn't for my personal user case, the X100V is probably not the camera for you. For example, the X100V is likely not the camera for you if it's going to be your only camera. The fixed lens system might become a little bit of a hindrance and not offer you the level of flexibility you want as your skill increases. If you're interested in video, the X-T4 might be the camera for you. It's probably the best camera in terms of video features. It also has interchangeable lenses so you can get nice and wide. The X-Pro3 is probably the camera for you if you really don't like screens, you love that classic feel, and the extra size really doesn't matter to you. But to me, this X100V has everything I wanted. Importantly for me, it had that optical viewfinder. It's also got a nice small package size, it's weather sealed, and can easily be accessorized to match some of the flexibility of some of the other cameras. So there we have it. That is why I chose the X100V out of all of the cameras Fuji has to offer. If you've got any questions for me, feel free to drop me a comment below and I'll try and get back to you. But as always guys, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.